Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today, Just Ask, Using Surveys and Focus Groups to Drive Development and Alumni Relations Success. Just a couple of housekeeping tips. If you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, and our presenters will either address them at the end or throughout the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Scott Atwell. Take it away, Scott.
All right, Griffin, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this exclusive webinar brought to you by Grinsbach, Lear & Associates. I am Scott Atwell, a Senior Vice President with the firm and also the co-leader of the Alumni Relations Practice Area. As Griffin mentioned, today we are presenting a panel discussion titled, as you can see, Just Ask, Using Surveys and Focus Groups to Drive Development and Alumni Relations Success. Our panel includes, in alphabetical order, the Senior Director of Development at Sidwell Friends School, Elizabeth Conley, the Director of Prospect Development Research at Boston College, Kathleen Sima-Lasmar, and a colleague of mine at GG&A, our Senior Vice President of Analytics, which includes serving as Director of our esteemed Survey Lab, Dan Lohman. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for tuning in wherever you are across the globe. As Griffin mentioned, from our Chicago headquarters, you can utilize the meeting interface, type in questions. Don't hesitate, and I will be glad to distribute them to the panel. So let's go back through the lineup one more time. I'll give a little more detail on our panelists' backgrounds and then ask an introductory question related to their experience. So Elizabeth, you first. 4 years now in your development role at Sidwell Friends School, which for those who may be unfamiliar is a highly selective Quaker school located in Bethesda, Maryland and Washington, D.C. It is pre-kindergarten through secondary. And prior to Sidwell, you served as Managing Director of Alumni Engagement at Suffolk University, where you earned both an undergraduate and master's degree. So you have this advancement experience in these two seemingly different arenas, but I'd like to know, what are the similarities but also the differences of advancement work in higher education and independent schools?
Well, thank you for having me today. I think it was a big adjustment for me when I came to Sidwell Friends, having spent close to 6 years prior to that at Suffolk University. And Suffolk is, in addition to being higher ed, it's a city university, which I think has its own nuances to alumni engagement that you wouldn't normally expect to sort of come across with maybe a more traditional campus setting. So coming to Sidwell Friends, I think some of the similarities that I immediately found is alumni volunteers, those who are really invested and engaged and care passionately about their school, no matter where you go, those are going to be the people that you can learn the most from and can be early educators for you as you try to learn a new culture, early supporters, and really can help guide you as you're trying to make an impact on the program. So for me, the benefit of having strong alumni volunteers, regardless of it being your high school or your college, was really something I think that I found to be really important in both settings. I think some of the differences would be I was working with individuals who not only for the undergraduate experience, but also alumni of graduate programs. So you're at a different stage in your life, and how you reconnect with an organization is different. And there was a real big focus while I was at Suffolk on more of the professional development connection and building your professional network. Whereas working at Sidwell Friends, for some of our alumni, this was the place that they spent the majority of their childhood and youth. And we have alumni who came here at age 5 and spent their, from pre-kindergarten through senior year of high school. And so it's a different experience for how they engage with the organization. And so learning that it's just as important to understand what their student experience was in order to be able to best serve them as alumni.
Well, that's a great perspective to bring to this webinar, Elizabeth. Thanks for being with us. And Kathleen, you are also in the 4th year of your current role at Boston College, where you lead a team of advancement intelligence professionals who deliver research and data analytics in support of university advancement. You have earned a pair of communications degrees, undergraduate from Western Michigan and a master's in communication research from Boston University. And prior to your role at BC, you spent 18 years in the private sector at the consulting firm Kantar, where your marketing research focused on customer satisfaction and relationship management, market segmentation, new product development, pricing, and product optimization, not to mention brand health management. So there's no wonder that at Boston College, you champion a culture of data-driven decision-making. You have lived it. So what parts of your 18 years focusing on the consumer informs your current work at BC?
Hi, Scott. Thanks for having me today. So many things from my past world informs what I do today. I think just focusing on consumers and businesses that I was working with in all of my previous career and translating that to the people we care about now in my world, prospects, donors, constituents, alumni. I think one of the things that I brought from my past career is recognizing that these are diverse people. They come from different perspectives and they all have different agendas, and we shouldn't make assumptions about who they are and what they want and what they care about. And a lot of times, both in the business world and I've observed in the nonprofit environment, we tend to see things from our own perspective, and we tend to talk to others as if they already understand where we're coming from. And I think learning about our constituents is something that we all can do better at, and to learn how to do that effectively so that we can take their perspective when talking to them, when appealing to them, when trying to invite them to join us on our journey as alumni or constituents or prospects. Another very sort of similar issue that we deal with in the business world is how in demand everyone's attention is. No different. We shouldn't assume that our alumni think of us as the center of their world. We shouldn't assume that they have all the time to interact with us. We need to be respectful of that. And that's exactly the same in the marketing world, where, you know, consumers don't have the time to talk to you or pay attention to what you want them to pay attention to. They're constantly being distracted by other things and other brands and other companies. And in this case, you know, as an institution, we have to be very cognizant of that as we try to communicate and work with them. So those are some of the things I think directly relate to the population that I work with now relative to what I did before.
Well, that's great feedback and perspective. I underscore, don't make assumptions. I was on a college campus for 25 years in various positions. And at some point in time, I really realized the importance of that statement, don't make assumptions, when I was asked to come up with some ideas of how to engage students. And I realized that at whatever age I was, 30s or 40s, I was in no position to be understanding how they wanted to be communicated with. We needed to ask them because my perspective was totally different from theirs. So underscore, don't make assumptions. Well, Dan Lohman, as I've been known to say, has been with UGNA a full third of the time the firm has been in existence. That's not to say that he's old, he's just experienced. No wonder he served hundreds and hundreds of clients in the nonprofit sector and hundreds more from colleges, universities, hospitals, and social service, advocacy, and cultural organizations. Dan is a proud alumnus of the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he graduated with college honors and went on to serve in the Peace Corps. And Dan, I won't ask you how the Peace Corps informs the work that you do, but that may actually be a good question. I will say that one of the things I really enjoy working with you is the insight that you bring to data. And an example for our panelists and our listeners, a few weeks back, Dan and I were on a call with a potential client, a national sorority, in fact, looking for a new young alumni strategy. And they asked us why we wanted to be on the project. And Dan's answer was unexpected, but in hindsight, maybe it shouldn't have been. He said, listen, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but most young alumni today come out with a bad taste in their mouths about their institutions. They've got this incredible debt. The school hasn't helped them land a job. They're in a bad mood. But the sorority experience may be the last remaining relationship on campus that's still positive. And I'd like to explore and contrast those ideas. So you brought a different layer of inquisitiveness that's so useful to survey work. And Dan, that's a really long-winded way of leading to this question, which is, how does one piece of your client work connect to the next piece and build up this reservoir of not just knowledge, but perspective that you bring to the work?
You know, I actually will answer this with a Peace Corps story. There's sort of an unofficial motto that is optimists see a glass half full, pessimists see a glass half empty, and Peace Corps volunteers say, I can take a bath in that.
Okay, good.
And I think that that's relevant because the work that I do at GG&A, and it's been 19 years, but I was a kid when I started, is every client's different. So you get this ability over the years to see the successes, the problems, the different kinds of donor and alumni and patron and patient marketplaces that exist. And I have to be careful not to fall into an easy consulting trap, which is taking what I heard yesterday at this client and then saying it again as though it's my advice to a client the next day, and really pulling it all together in a way that you can tell a coherent story about what really constitutes a best practice or what really constitutes something that may not be a good idea. And I think surveys and market research in our space fit right into that, because we start to get at the heart of how do we consolidate what young alumni or donors above $10,000 or patients who have no donor relationship to a hospital, and start to craft that into a set of concepts that we can start to put into recommendations. And honestly, that's the hardest thing I do, but it's also my favorite.
Well, if you're just joining us, this is the Just Ask webinar, using surveys and focus groups to drive development and alumni relations success. Our distinguished panel includes the Senior Director of Development at Sidwell Friends School, Elizabeth Conley, the Director of Prospect Development Research at Boston College, Kathleen Sima-Lasmar, and the Senior Vice President of Analytics at Grinsbach, Lear & Associates, Dan Lohman. I'm Scott Atwell, a co-practice area leader at GG&A, and we'd love to share your questions with our panel. Don't hesitate to send them via the meeting portal. Elizabeth, I'll circle back to you. And a critical question around our subject is the seminal question of when to survey, or perhaps another way to put it is why to survey. What have been the drivers behind the surveys that you have commissioned either at Sidwell Friends or Suffolk University?
Sure. I laugh because I think they asked me to do an alumni survey for Sidwell Friends during my interview. So even before I had started, my boss was really looking to understand the alumni community better. And I didn't do an alumni survey until 2.5 years into my tenure. And I really thought it was important for the alumni director who had been in the role prior to my joining the team had been here for close to a decade. So there was a sort of a system that was already in place. People knew the programs that she had built, and I was looking to build on that foundation, but also to, kind of take it into a new direction. But I wanted time to get to know the alumni community a little personally, and to have more one-on-one conversations, because I thought it was important for me to know the community before I survey them. I don't think you can build a great survey unless you know who you're talking to. And another reason why I thought it was important for us to wait was I said to my boss that it's important that you not only survey on the program that you currently have, but survey your alumni on the program that you hope to build. Have it be aspirational. I didn't need to know as much feedback on some of our existing programs. I hear a lot about our reunion program or some of our more traditional based programs. I was looking to survey to find out where would alumni want us to go. And so again, I thought it was important to better understand the community before I built that survey. One of the drivers and why we decided to do it, we did the survey last winter, so it was sent out in February of 2018, and we conducted a number of focus groups around it as well, was last fall the school announced the strategic action plan, and it was really a time when our alumni board was asking, how can we tie the work of the Alumni Association Executive Board and the alumni program to be aligned with this school strategic action plan and its plans for the next 5 to 10 years. And so it really just felt like the right time to do it. We had sort of questions that we could organize the survey based around the pillars of our strategic action plan, and we felt that we knew at that time what we were looking to do and how we were looking to grow, and that this was a good time to do it. When I had been a part of a survey at Suffolk, it was told to us by a consultant that we had at that time that we really needed to do it, and I felt like it wasn't the right time, and our staff wasn't asked for a lot of feedback on how to organize the questions or what questions to ask, and I don't think we used that data because it wasn't what we as a staff could use. And so I think it's really important that you spend the time to draft one that makes sense for your community. And Dan will laugh when they presented it to our alumni board. And a shout out, we have a Sidwell alumna on the call today, actually, who works for a university in the New England area. But I said that there would be a lot of feedback from my alumni board, and Dan said, no, we don't usually get a lot of feedback, and I think this is pretty standard. And Dan can attest that we had a lot of nuanced changes to make. And so while it was a more tedious activity to go through than maybe other schools might have to, it was the right way for us to do it based on what we were looking to get from our alumni. Our alumni is a really thoughtful community, and so I think the when and the why, it should also be, you should also consider the how as well.
Yeah, well, kudos to you and your team for connecting the alumni strategic plan to the institutional strategic plan, because that is something that we really emphasize in our consulting work with our clients. Kathleen, I'll come back to you. An institution the size and complexity of Boston College, your alumni are certainly receiving lots of emails, no matter how well you're managing that process. And these survey instruments are in fact electronically based, so the question of fatigue, it naturally comes up in the conversation. We're inviting constituents to take part in yet another activity. So how do you manage this part of the work?
Yeah, it definitely, the issue of fatigue is one to be careful with and mindful of. It is another email. We are making another request of our alumni, and what we do with our surveys is we schedule the survey emails right into our communications calendar. It gets debated over along with appeals and alumni relations, communications, and everything else. And it's front and center so that all the other groups operating out of the advancement office are aware of the survey that is happening. It is a different request and a different email. It isn't like a gift appeal or a broader communication. So you do get different type of attention from your audience, and that's a good thing. So you want to recognize that. You want to be clear that this particular email is about inviting you to provide your feedback or opinion. We treat it like any other email where we're concerned about the open rates and the response rates. We take care with the quality of communication in it. The signatory, who is making the request, is something to consider and be careful with. Another thing that we do with one of the surveys that we do on a regular annual basis, we rotate the sample so that somebody who responded to the survey last year is not invited until 2 years out. And so that gives everyone some breathing room, and they don't feel like, didn't I just answer this survey? So we try to be respectful of their time and give them sort of a rest period, if you will. And that requires managing this information in your database and making sure that you don't accidentally put people in subsequent surveys too closely together and get them really tired of your asking them questions. The only exception we have to that is event satisfaction surveys, which we also do and treat a little differently. We think of event satisfaction surveys as the right of the attendee to tell us what they think. So it's almost disrespectful not to send that, in our opinion. So we try to send that, and we think because it is referencing an event that they just attended, that it is not quite the same thing as a broad general survey invitation. So those are some of the things that we do to just be mindful of the fatigue, but we do recognize it's there, and we have to care for that.
Yeah, great advice. Dan, we have some questions coming in. I'm going to toss this first one to you. It has to do with statistical relevance. I think that's how to underscore this one. Therese Riley asks, how do the panelists determine whether a critical sample is reliable and valid when using the data to inform new or different practices and programs?
Oh, this is the kind of question I like to answer. I could spend 15 minutes on sample size calculators, but I'll spare you. So there's a science to part of it, which is if there's you can actually just Google sample size calculator and you'll find some good stuff that'll do the math for you. But there are ways to say if we have 20,000 people that we want to survey, so whether that's your alumni base or if it's 200 people who went to an event yesterday, and you can calculate how many responses you need to get in order to have a margin of error. How accurate how likely are we to be able to extrapolate these results and be right to the larger population? There's a little more philosophical piece that follows that scientific bit, which is a good starting guideline. But then you have to think about really who are you trying to get at, and in terms of determining sort of a critical level for statistical significance. If you're targeting young alumni as just one example, but you send a survey to a bunch of people who aren't young alumni, that's going to influence those results. So obviously everything you have to do has to come back to who are you trying to get answers from, and then looking at the results that as data rolls in or as you get the final data back, looking for data that doesn't necessarily make sense and is it skewed in certain ways. It's not uncommon for us to see kind of a dip in satisfaction for graduates from the 1970s. There was just a lot going on in the world and on college campuses at that time. And pretty consistently, we see this little dip in terms of both participation and in whether they feel positive about the place or if they feel loyal. So looking for those kinds of anomalies then allows you to go back and either account for it in sort of a technical way or just understand it and be able to explain that we're seeing that these different sectors, different segments of the population are responding in ways that we wouldn't have expected.
What's the smallest survey sample size that you've ever conducted?
So the magic number is 30, that if you actually have a random distribution of 30 names across a relative population, you're getting pretty close to something that will probably consistently show up over time. That's a bit flippant because it's a little more complicated than that. But Kathleen just referred to event surveys. Most events don't have that many people, and it makes sense to survey them. And the reality is that even though you may not have a genuinely statistically valid sample, if you have 100 attendees, 40 of them take the survey and 10 of them say terrible things about the event, that's valuable, even if we can't necessarily say that applies to all events. And then if you keep doing the surveys, you can start to aggregate it and look at, is it our bigger events? Is it our smaller events? Is it the ones that the president is speaking at that get the worst marks? Is it places where there's no parking? And you can start to evaluate it that way. So at some point you go from survey to kind of focus group focus group or market research, which is a little different than kind of quantitative surveys, but you can go small or big.
I have another question here. Our friend Alan Raya from Vermont has a question. I think it related to what Kathleen was talking about. So Kathleen, I'll send it your way. And Alan's asking, what type of integrated communications calendar management tool are you using at Boston College to manage the process?
So I am not sure. I know that the the communications team uses Smartsheets as a general project management tool, but I'm not sure if it's literally what's being used to manage the communication calendar. I do know, I can say that we have meetings of all interested parties to go over the dates and everything together, but I'm not really sure of the actual software that they're using.
Okay. Another question is from Stephanie, and it has to do with surveying parents. And so, Elizabeth, I'll toss it to you first, and anyone else who wants to weigh in on it. Stephanie asks, in addition to conducting alumni surveys, does anyone on the panel conduct surveys of current and alumni parents? If so, what is your main goal in doing so, and how do you go about preparing questions?
We have done parent surveys in the past, and I think that we are at the point where we're due to do another parent survey in the next year. We had a new chief communication officer join the school in the fall, and so I think we're trying to allow for her to understand the community and culture a little more before we work on drafting that survey. But surveying current parents is something that we do, and I think that there's a real need to do that for. Obviously, in the independent school level, it would be different from higher ed. When I worked at Suffolk, we hadn't surveyed the parent community from an advancement or development perspective. We were only starting a parent program in coordination with the Office of Student Affairs. So I'm sure probably at this point they have, or they would be considering it. But at the independent school level, current parents are a group that we are looking to survey quite often, because they are probably one of our most active, or the most active constituent group that we have. For alumni parents, we haven't. I am open to it, but it kind of goes back to what I had said earlier, that I don't think we were quite ready when I first arrived to do an alumni survey for what I thought the program could build into. And we have had some great success over the last couple of years of better, doing a better job at more thoughtfully integrating our parents of alumni into our engagement plans. But I think that we still have a little more work to do before we could do a comprehensive survey, because I would want to make sure, I think it's important before you survey that you are prepared to be able to implement some of the suggestions or the data that you're collecting. People, I think, are more frustrated when they've taken the time to answer questions about how you want them to be engaged, and then there isn't another, an immediate follow-up to that. So I think that down the line we could. We mixed in focus groups during our survey, and so I think that in the interim that we could probably do some focus groups with parents of alumni that either have been really active or those that we are looking to engage that haven't been, and in the interim before we conduct a survey, I think a focus group could be probably really beneficial for us.
Another question just came in from Mike Bates that speaks directly to what you were just talking about, the frustration that might exist of survey takers if they don't understand what you're doing with the data. So Mike writes, is it generally a good idea to share highlights of the survey results with the general alumni population on a website or in a magazine? Kathleen, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure. So I have not very publicly released survey results. We've used it more in communications back to the population that we asked to answer the survey, and share by, especially as Elizabeth says, if we are taking action based on something that came out from that we learned through the survey. We've gone back to the population and said, we heard this from you and these are the actions we're taking. But we haven't kind of published any survey results in a more public forum like a website or in the magazine. Whether or not that's a good idea, I think depends. I think if you had the intention of doing that, then it'll be important to design your survey to make sure that that it's fair, that you're not, throwing a question into a broader survey and then using that question out of context and making a claim out of it. In the corporate world, this falls under advertising law and claim legality, so it's something that we would be very careful about in the business world, but in nonprofit, I'm sure it's a lot less concerning about claims, but you still have to be thoughtful, and I think it would be important to be fair so that you're not taking something out of context and then using it in a public manner for either marketing purposes or any other communication purposes.
That is a
So those are
great
my
point.
thoughts on that.
Yeah, great point to make. Dan, do you have a perspective on this question?
Just to add on that, it depends on both your goal of the survey or goals and the audience. So if you're surveying a relatively narrow part of the population for some very specific purposes, it may make sense to share it with people from that group, but it may also just make sense to share it internally or with board and volunteer committees that are related to that specific issue. In kind of all alumni surveys, there is a tendency that I think is probably a good one, which is to disseminate some of the information. And it, it doesn't have to be the results of every single question. It probably shouldn't be, but clients put together infographics that they put in their alumni magazine or put on the website or send it out by email that, maybe cover some of the big points of, some very positive things that came out of it, but also a few, we heard you and we're working on this. I think there can be a lot of value in that. Surveys are not simply a data collection tool. They are also a stewardship tool in their own right. So just by virtue of going out and asking people rather than asking for money, asking for their opinion, which they're often happy to give, to be able to come back and say a lot of alumni participated in this, which is a positive, and here's what we learned, and it makes people feel like they're inside the tent a little bit.
Yeah, the stewardship question is one I have for a little bit later for one of our panelists here, but I'm going to circle back to Elizabeth and ask if you could give some examples of how you leverage the data that you receive from your surveys. In other words, the examples of turning the survey data into action.
Sure. So we had task forces on our board that were broken down into 3 areas that we focused on for our survey. So we, each of those task forces were responsible for taking the data that was collected in the survey and sort of turning them into action steps for us to work on as a board and as an alumni program. So at a high level, we were doing that. We also used some of the questions as what my board clerk affectionately calls to myth bust, that anecdotally I will hear things in the alumni community. Someone will say something to me, or an alumni volunteer will share feedback that they got. But you can't, we weren't in a position to address those comments in a broader way, just on an anecdotal level. So we asked some of those questions to address some of those things, and I'll give an example. We often hear that alumni think that the school has too much money, is too wealthy, when in fact our endowment is not as large as many of our sort of peer schools in DC, and then those that we would be considered peers with on the national level. And so we were hearing that anecdotally, but it was great for us to be able to take that and say, based on the survey, 75% of alumni think that either we have too much money or that we're adequately funded. Well, here's a look at the Sybil Friends School financial model, and here's where there's opportunity to grow. So it was great to be able to address it head on, and it felt really transparent and authentic, because it wasn't just addressing rumors or hearsay. This was really, hey, 75% of you are feeling this way, and here's our chance to have a conversation with you to talk about the actual situation the school is in.
If you're just joining us, this is the Just Ask webinar, using surveys and focus groups to drive development and alumni relations success. Our distinguished panel includes the Senior Director of Development at Sidwell Friends School, Elizabeth Conley, whom just spoke, the Director of Prospect Development Research at Boston College, Kathleen Sima-Lasmar, and the Senior Vice President of Analytics at Grinzebach Leary & Associates, Dan Lohman. I'm Scott Atwell, Co-Practice Area Leader at GG&A, and we'd love to share your questions with our panel. Don't hesitate to send them along through the meeting portal. Kathleen, let me come back to you. Almost everyone is doing surveys. It's something that can be done without counsel. Certainly, you have the qualifications with all the experience you have to do this on your own. What made you want to utilize a firm like GG&A to handle your survey work at BC?
Yeah, I think anyone can do surveys for sure. They're not super complicated. They can on occasion and unfortunately be done poorly. And I think all of us have received a survey from a company or somebody that, just was so poorly phrased and questions don't make sense, or they don't give you the right answer choices, that you worry about what they're learning from that survey. And that's something to consider. So I think if anyone has enough experience, either through schoolwork or work experience, to develop decent surveys, then I don't think it's a complicated thing to do on your own. However, we chose to work with Dan and GGNA for some of our surveys because, one, they have the resources to put a team together and be focused on these surveys. These surveys can take a lot of attention to detail to do them and execute them correctly, and we simply don't have that kind of resources to apply to it. And we were prioritizing these surveys that we have and caring very much that it is done well and high quality. And so GGNA became that sort of extension of our team, if you will, to be able to execute well. And they do that very well, I have to say. The other thing that GGNA brought to the table was the higher ed expertise, the experience working with other institutions, and to be able to bring some perspective that we wouldn't otherwise have on our own. So to be able to say, this percentage that we're seeing for you on this question, we typically see these percentages or this range with some of our other clients, or we've dealt with this type of a problem. And these are some of the solutions that we've used in those situations. So GGNA was able to bring basically perspective from other work that they've done, which is valuable. I think it's important not to assume that we know what we know, and that's sufficient, to be open-minded to the advice and perspective that others have. So those are some of the reasons why we worked with GGNA for our survey, some of our surveys.
Thank you. Dan, let me extend one of the points that Kathleen just made, in the fact that there are so many decisions that have to be made on the front end of survey work, including but not limited to decisions around the data set that's being used. I think you talked about that earlier, the segmentation strategies, the instrument itself, the length of it, the organization of it, types of questions, are they binary, multiple choice, matrix? If you were to think of a survey as a cooking, a great meal in the kitchen, and there's all these ingredients that go into the recipe, I want to go shopping with you. Take me down the shopping aisle. Tell me how you decide what you take off the shelf, and what is your process for determining the ingredients?
That's a very interesting question, and framing of it too. I guess I'd start with, you have to decide what you want to eat, to take your metaphor a step further. And then you back into a lot of those somewhat technical questions. So in terms of deciding, what are your burning questions? What keeps you up at night? And Elizabeth gave an example of this perception of having too much money or too little money, which informs communications about what is the actual need at a place like Sidwell Friends that may be misunderstood among the alumni population, or some really kind of tactical things. And those of you who know me know that I can't talk without a data chart, so I brought some with me, and let me jump to, I think it's the last one. So this is an example of a survey that was focused on the donor experience and stewardship and donor relations. And it asked people who made a gift in some recent time frame to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how they felt about each one of these things. And if you look down at the bottom, for example, there's something that's really tactical. Know whom to contact in the event that I have a question about my gift. And what the 58.8 means is that just about 59% of the people who took the survey said that this institution had informed them basically who to contact. They understood who they should contact. And it's red because that means that more than 60 or 40% of people don't know the answer to that question. But that's an easy fix, right? That's the kind of thing where you can put the picture of the donor relations person at the bottom of the receipt. And instead of just saying contact donor relations, if you have a question, it could say contact Dan Lohman, or hi, I'm Dan Lohman, I'm the donor relations person. And that number will rise. And then to make it more complicated, if you look at the bottom row on this one of I understand the impact my gift will have, only 41% of the people who took the survey said that they felt that way. That's really problematic, and it's much harder to fix. So if, in an attempt to actually try to answer your question, the ingredients that you pull off the shelf are, we're worried, or we want to understand how our donor experience is felt by donors, not just our internal assessment of if we're doing a good job. And then we can start to look at what's the best way to ask this question. Is it multiple choice? Is it a scale? Is it a matrix question? Is it a free text question? And then build the survey around what your outcomes are supposed to be. So I think it all comes back to, let's start with the fact that I want a chicken curry for dinner tonight, and then let's figure out what the ingredients are.
Right. Start with the end in mind. I have another question from our friend Ann Keith from Dartmouth, and it has to do with receiving unexpected negative results from a survey. So let me read what Ann has written here, and it has multiple questions that for both Elizabeth and Kathleen, and then at the end for Dan. Ann says, how about when survey results are significantly different from expectations? As if, let's say, as an example, very negative, where a program failed or something. For Elizabeth and Kathleen, have you had experiences like this, and how did you share or process the information internally? And then for Dan, what suggestions do you have for sharing, processing such challenging, shocking results internally with university leadership as an example? So Elizabeth and Kathleen, let me go to you first. Elizabeth, you can start if you have a response to Ann's question.
Sure. I didn't have that experience when we surveyed at Sidwell. The survey was very positive for the most part. There was critical feedback, and people gave us thoughtful recommendations in some of the open-ended questions, but we didn't have sort of a real big sort of red flag that was raised from the survey. When I was at Suffolk, there was we had conducted the survey shortly after our long-serving president stepped down, and there was some controversy around his departure and his pay at the time. And so that, I don't think it was necessarily new information that we learned from the survey that we didn't already know and we were hearing from alumni, but certainly the feedback received was strong criticism of the university at that time. So it was something that we really had to bring to the leadership team, the acting president, the provost, and the dean. So again, it wasn't unexpected, but it certainly caused us to have to pull in other key campus partners to work with us of how we were going to, move forward and be able to build the trust back up in our community.
Kathleen, do you have an experience? It sort of circles back to the question Mike Bates had, which is how do you share the information that you get back with constituents?
Yeah, I think to address this question more directly about internal sort of surprises, we did have an experience where the feedback in the survey was overwhelmingly positive on all aspects except one. And we needed to be careful not to sort of overemphasize this negative feedback. It wasn't super negative, it just wasn't as positive as everything else. So to the detriment of that department, to make them look bad in the presentation of our results. So a couple of things. One is we execute the sort of key individuals leading the survey process, myself and a colleague, we're neutral parties, so to speak, and I think that helps. We're trying to come at it from an objective point of view and try and present and share out results. The second thing that was important in our work was to have buy-in from all the groups and with leadership of the organization. I'm talking about a fairly strategic survey that we did that involved all departments. So having leadership present when we crafted the questions, when we designed the survey, and then through the process, so that by the time we shared results, there was a lot of partnership in it. It didn't feel like we were coming in and sort of throwing things at the audience. It was very much, we've worked through this and this is what we've learned together. I think that sort of mindset and mentality in that final presentation, if you will, is way more useful. Then people can be more constructive about how to use this information. And finally, that was a lot of the focus was how to be constructive with this. So rather than focus on this is negative feedback and this is saying basically this department isn't doing as well, we focused on how do we improve this feeling that our alumni and prospects and donors have, and kind of channeled the question into a more constructive, solution-minded type of conversation. But we shared the information anyway, and it was feedback that we had to take and swallow and process and then do something with. But those are some of the ways we've tried to kind of make that feedback go a little easier as we shared that internally with the organization.
Yeah, that's great advice, getting the buy-in from the beginning. Dan, what about you? Any advice for sharing shocking or challenging information with the university or leadership?
I mean, I guess I'd say, why else are you doing the survey? If your expectations are that everything is great and the feedback you're getting is that everything's great, and you're not worried about it, then maybe you don't necessarily need a survey. So I think a lot of the surveys that I work on are, in fact, to uncover where there are weaknesses in programs. I don't know that we come across too many shocking failures, and I know Ann at Dartmouth does not have a lot of shocking failures in her program. But I think that when you get unambiguously bad data, or even just things that point to the negative, that's the real learning. If something is taking up resources and it's something that has been plugging along and you're just not sure about its utility, a survey can come in and help you pinpoint some of those issues. And then I'll say finally about this, that one of the nice things about surveys is that they just are what they are. We went out and we asked 5,000 people a question and we got these answers. You're not trying to convince somebody that the statistical model is valid, or that the input that they're getting from a very close volunteer board and sort of some loud voices are in fact what the truth is. And a survey doesn't necessarily deliver the whole truth. But when you're talking about presenting it to leadership, you can come back and say, look, we went out and we asked, or we had an independent third party go out and ask, here's the impact. Here's what we heard. So now we have to think about how to respond.
Another question just came in from Natalie Graff, and she wants to know about creative approaches to increase survey responses. She says she typically sees 1% to 2%, even with incentives. You all have some thoughts on how to better improve the response rate surveys?
I'm happy to kick that off.
Sure.
We generally, if for alumni populations, we generally see response rates between 10 and 20%, and they can go higher sometimes with very closely held, super rabid alumni populations. Sometimes they're a little lower. The key thing is the from line and the subject line. I think it's about getting people's attention. It's about having them understand that this isn't a solicitation for a gift, positioning it as we're asking you for your input, and we value your feedback. And I think that's the number one driver, honestly. And then, there's some tricks of the trade, right, of doing some reminders and, maybe doing one on a weekend when people are on their phones and a couple during the workday. On the incentives front, we don't always find that we need them, and we have found very consistently that financial incentives are either on par or not as good as sort of items you can wear with pride. People like hoodies and sweatshirts and things along those lines, especially people who are responding to the survey, who are expressing just by doing that they have some desire to be part of your community.
Kathleen or Elizabeth,
also,
strategies?
Yeah, I would, so one of the things that we've done, especially if we're talking about a higher end prospect for development related work that we're doing, we would actually have prospect managers and fundraisers reach out and let them know, to make a more personal touch, either a phone call or an outreach that says, we're doing the survey. We really appreciate if you would look out for that email that will come on Friday. We really want your feedback, and those are helpful. It just helps folks, call people's attention to one of these many emails that will be coming into their inbox. I would also say that I am typically wary of using incentives, especially monetary types of incentives, for satisfaction surveys. You don't want people to be put in a conflicting position of how they are going to respond to how satisfied they are about something by giving them an incentive. So I try to avoid using them in certain types of surveys.
Mm-hmm. A similar question along these lines, BJ Davison asks, have you used a popular alumni or influential alumni to champion a survey?
I can answer that. I was going to say we didn't use any incentives and giveaways or civil swag to incentivize, but we partnered with our alumni board, our class representatives, our regional clerks, and we're really using them to kind of help encourage classmates and then folks in their region to participate. And then we really made our alumni board clerk the face of the survey. So when you had talked about sharing out results, we had him do a video message, and also the letter even introducing the alumni survey to the community came from him. So we thought it was it worked better for us having it feel more peer-to-peer and less like the institution was driving the survey.
Yeah, so a social ambassador type of approach.
We are social media extension of that as well. I mean, that promotion saying the survey's coming, or here's a link to the survey. I have a client who put an ad on the back page of the Alumni magazine that went out, 2 weeks before the survey went out, that said, be on the lookout for it. All those kinds of things I think help.
Yeah. Kathleen, did you have a point on that?
We definitely use alumni who are trustees or, head of the alumni board, prominent alumni to be the signatory on our invitations for surveys, and kind of bring them in the fold in terms of, asking the broader alumni population to respond.
We have about 5 minutes left in our webinar, so I want to get to some more questions. One that came in from one of our listeners, Aaron Shreve, and it has to do with focus groups. I think, Elizabeth, you were talking about focus groups. Aaron wants to know how you identify the individuals to join those groups, and how do you know when you've accomplished your goal? In other words, when you can end the focus group.
Sure. So we sent out the first round of sort of recruiting for some of the focus groups, I worked with some of my colleagues of who are alumni that you really want to hear from. So using it as a cultivation tool. So reaching out to some of those folks first, but then also doing a broad ask, so it would be a nice representation of the alumni community. We broke it down by region. So we hosted 2 in DC, but then also hosted one in New York and did virtual ones for alumni that were outside of DC and New York, but kind of focusing on alumni in Boston and San Francisco and LA. So I definitely worked with my colleagues to first identify if there were folks that we wanted to really use this as a tool to engage them, and making sure that I did a personal ask of those folks, but then being mindful not to have it be weighted to one side and really having it be a good representation of the community.
I promised to explore the idea of surveys as a form of engagement. So Kathleen, I'll circle back to you on this one. What is your take on the survey as an engagement tool?
So I think there's certainly a form of engagement. It is a touch point. It is an interaction between ourselves and our constituents. So we have to be thoughtful. We have to be just as polite and everything else. But I would say that using it as a tool for engagement is something you have to be careful. Not that you can't do it. I do think it is possible to do that. But you want to be respectful of their time and their willingness to help. You don't want to sort of abuse that goodwill on their side to give you feedback just as an excuse to engage with them, and you don't ask questions that are genuine or meaningful. I think consumers, constituents, they can smell you from afar. If you're disingenuous in your outreach to them, I think it will come across that way. So I think if you genuinely want their opinion on something and you use this as an opportunity to connect with them in a meaningful way, then it's very well and good a tool for engagement. But to do it just to put a touch point out there in any sort of disingenuous way, I think is a risk. So the other point would be to be prepared to take their feedback and do something about it if you're going to reach out and ask them for their opinion.
That's great advice. Dan, narrowing down here on the top of the hour, but I want to ask you this question. What does an institution or an organization need to have and do in order to be successful with a survey project?
Oh, that's easy. A plan. It gets right back to things that my panelists have been talking about throughout this, which is starting with what's the problem that you're trying to solve. And that's okay if the problem is we just want a better understanding of our donor or our alumni or our patron base. And then, we start to narrow it down from there. The projects that don't go well are the ones where it's hard to wrangle a plan, and that's usually not the fault of the person who shows up through GG&A's front door and says that they want to learn more. It's usually as we get down the path and all of a sudden you start including multiple people from multiple parts of an organization that all want to have input on the survey. If you haven't come to that discussion with here are the things that we're trying to achieve through the context of a survey project, then you have no way to push back on that. I had a small college where they included somebody from the head of facilities management on a committee to help approve the survey content. And she wanted to add questions about the adequacy of parking on campus.
Too many cooks in the kitchen there, right?
Useful, right? It's a little bit different from the other questions about reunion, although maybe parking at reunion's an issue. So it's a two-word answer is a plan and sometimes some outside help helps put that plan together. Sometimes you can put that plan together internally, but without one, it's not a good place to take the next step.
And with that, that will be the final word of our webinar. Thanks to our panelists, the Senior Director of Development at Sidwell Friends School, Elizabeth Conley, the Director of Prospect Development Research at Boston College, Kathleen Sim-Alasmar, and the Senior Vice President of Analytics and Survey Lab Director at GG&A, Dan Lohman. Our thanks also to Griffin Croft, managing things from our Chicago office. I'm Scott Atwell. This webinar has been a production of Grinsbach, Lear & Associates, consultants in philanthropic management, where our mission is advancing yours. Good day.